The text came in at 11:42 on a Tuesday night. I was in bed, not sleeping. I had not been sleeping well for several weeks, though I had not said that to anyone, and my phone lit up on the nightstand with my husband's name. I assumed it was something ordinary, a reminder about something, a question about the morning. I picked it up without sitting up. The message was 4 sentences. The first said he was sorry to do it this way. The second said he had been trying to find the right moment for a long time and could not find one. The third said he was leaving. The fourth said it was for my sister. I read it twice. Then I put the phone face down on the nightstand and lay there in the dark for a moment, looking at the ceiling. Then I picked the phone back up and typed one word. Finally, I set the phone down again. Outside, a car went past slowly, its headlights traveling across the bedroom wall and disappearing. I listened to the house settle around me, the particular sounds a building makes at night, the small creaks and shifts that become part of the texture of where you live after enough years that you stop hearing them as sounds and start hearing them as silence. Then I got up, went to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and sat down at the table to wait for it to boil. There is quite a lot of ground to cover before that night makes complete sense. The beginning is about 14 months earlier, and it starts with something I noticed and decided not to look at, which is, I think, where most of these stories actually begin. My name is Sarah Calloway. I am 39 years old. I work as a senior financial analyst for a regional investment management firm in Richmond, Virginia. The kind of job where you spend your days reading numbers, the way other people read sentences, looking for the meaning underneath the surface, the patterns that tell you what is actually happening as opposed to what is being presented. I have been doing this for 12 years. I am good at it, not because I am particularly gifted, but because I am methodical, and because I have a genuinely high tolerance for sitting with incomplete information until it becomes complete. In financial analysis, patience is not a personality trait. It is a professional requirement. We lived in the Fan District, one of those Richmond neighborhoods of narrow row houses and wide sidewalks and enormous oak trees whose roots have been slowly destroying the pavement for 100 years, and nobody can bring themselves to remove. Our house was a brick row house on Floyd Avenue, 3 floors, with a bay window in the front room that let in the afternoon light in a way I had loved from the very first time I walked through it. Marcus and I bought it 6 years earlier, the year after we married. The previous owners had left a small iron planter on the front stoop that we had never moved and had gradually started treating as our own, watering it in the summer, replacing the plants when they died. The way you absorb small things into your life without deciding to. Richmond in October is a particular kind of beautiful. The Fan in autumn has a quality I never quite got used to in 6 years of living there. The trees turning in stages, one block slightly ahead of the next, so that walking home from the parking garage some evenings felt like moving through something still being finished. Marcus was 42. He ran a small architecture firm with 2 partners, one of whom, a man named Dennis, had become a fixture in our social life, present at enough dinners and enough casual Saturdays to become part of the furniture of our shared life. Marcus was the kind of person who filled a room without appearing to try, warm in a way that was not performed, funny in a dry way that arrived without announcing itself. People were drawn to him, which I had always understood and had always been, if I am being accurate, slightly watchful of, not with suspicion, just with the awareness that people who draw other people tend to collect complications. We had met at a friend's dinner party when I was 29. He had been seated across from me and spent the first 20 minutes of the evening talking to the person on his left, which gave me time to observe him before he turned his attention my way. He was a genuine listener, the kind of listening that most people only approximate, that shows up in the follow-up question, in the small detail remembered 3 conversations later, when he finally asked what I did, and I explained it. He asked a question that demonstrated he had actually understood my answer. That was the first thing I noticed. It remained one of the things I most respected about him. For a long time, we dated for 2 years before we married. The wedding was small. 30 people, a restaurant in the museum district, a Saturday in May. My sister Joanna was my maid of honor. She cried during the ceremony in the particular way people cry when they are genuinely happy for someone else. Not sad about anything, just moved. I remember standing there in front of 30 people thinking that I was lucky. Lucky to be marrying him and lucky to have her. And lucky that the two of them got along the way they did, easily and naturally, without any of the friction that sometimes develops between a spouse and a sibling. That is the memory I have returned to most often in the months since all of this happened. The three of us in that room. How certain everything felt. Joanna was 4 years younger than me. She had lived in Richmond for most of her adult life. Not always nearby, but near enough. 3 years before any of this happened, she had gone through a difficult divorce. A long and exhausting process that had left her genuinely depleted in a way that took time to recover from. Marcus and I had both been present during that period. Dinners, when she needed company, help with logistics during the move, an occasional loan when things were tight. I had been there the way you are there for a sister. Marcus had been there the way a kind brother-in-law is there. Or so I had understood it. The first indication that something was not what I understood it to be happened about 14 months before the text message arrived. We had all had dinner together at a restaurant in Carytown. Marcus and me, Joanna and a man named Paul, she had been seeing for a few months, pleasant enough and largely unmemorable. The dinner was easy in the way dinners are easy when everyone at the table knows each other well. Toward the end of the evening, Paul went to find the bathroom, and I went to find our server about the check. And when I came back, Marcus and Joanna were laughing at something that stopped when I sat down. Not conspicuously. The laugh just ended. The way a conversation ends naturally when someone joins it. Marcus said something about the wine. We moved on. I did not think about it for several weeks. Then I thought about it once, and set it down. That is the version of myself I have spent the most time sitting with. Afterward, the one who noticed the small thing, reached for the nearest comfortable explanation, and kept moving. On the kitchen windowsill, between a small clay pot of herbs that I kept meaning to water more reliably, and a stack of cookbooks I had owned for years, and almost never used, there was a photograph in a thin silver frame. Marcus and me on the Outer Banks, the summer before we got married. Both of us squinting into the sun, him with his arm around me. Both of us clearly happy. I had placed it there when we moved in and had long since stopped seeing it. It had become part of the room the way things become part of rooms when they have been in the same place for long enough. The discovery did not happen on the night of the text message. The text was the confirmation of something I had already started to understand. The actual discovery happened 6 weeks earlier, on a Thursday afternoon in October, when I came home from work 2 hours earlier than usual, because a meeting had been cancelled, and I had decided, on a whim, to leave the office at 3, instead of staying until 6 as I typically did. The house was quiet when I came in. Marcus worked late on Thursdays as a rule, and I was not expecting him until 7 or 8. I went to the kitchen to make coffee. The back door was unlocked. Not unusual. We were both occasionally careless about the back door, but something made me look more carefully at the kitchen, and what I noticed was this. 2 coffee cups in the sink, both recently used, the coffee still faintly visible at the bottom of each, and on the kitchen table, pushed slightly to one side, as though someone had moved it out of the way at some point during the afternoon, was a woman's cardigan that I recognized immediately, pale grey, slightly oversized. Joanna had been wearing it constantly for the better part of a year. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then I took out my phone, opened the shared calendar app, and looked at Marcus's calendar for the past 11 weeks. Every Thursday afternoon was blocked. The description on each entry said the same thing. Site, visit. He had never mentioned which sites. I had never asked. I picked up the grey cardigan and held it for a moment, the fabric slightly cool in my hands. Then I folded it carefully and set it back on the table in exactly the position I had found it. I made my coffee. I went upstairs to my home office and opened my laptop and stared at a spreadsheet without reading it for approximately 20 minutes. Marcus came home at 7:30. He kissed me on the cheek and said the site visit had run longer than expected. I said, "Which site?" He named a building in Calloway Bottom, a renovation project he had mentioned a few weeks earlier in passing. I said, "How is it coming along?" He said, "Actually, well, Better than we expected, I said. That's good. Dinner will be ready in about 20 minutes. He went upstairs to change. I stood at the stove and thought about 2 coffee cups and a grey cardigan and 11 Thursday afternoons, accounted for in precisely the same vague way. And I made a decision about how I was going to approach the next several weeks. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened over the 6 weeks between the Thursday with the cardigan and the Tuesday night text, because I think it is easy to make it sound colder than it actually was. It was not cold. The feelings were there. They were just underneath the work rather than on top of it, which is a different arrangement than most people expect. There were mornings when Marcus made coffee and handed me a cup before I came downstairs, the way he had done for years, and I said thank you, and we talked about the day ahead, his meetings, my client deadlines, the dripping faucet in the upstairs bathroom that had been on our list for 3 weeks. Everything looked exactly as it always had. From the inside, I was building a case. I cried once. On a Wednesday evening when Marcus was at a work dinner and I was alone in the house, I had just finished going through the phone records for the second time, and the full scope of what I was looking at had finally accumulated into something I could not intellectually manage around. I sat at the kitchen table and cried for about 10 minutes. Then I washed my face and went back to the table and added 3 more entries to the notebook and made dinner. The leather notebook with the broken pen clip had been in my desk drawer for 4 years. I had bought it at a small stationery shop near my office and had used it for work notes and the occasional observation I wanted to preserve, but did not want to put into a device. The cover was worn smooth from being carried around. The pen clip had broken off sometime in the 2nd year and left a small, rough ridge of metal on the spine that I had stopped noticing long ago. Now I was using it to document my marriage, date by date, and figure by figure, and it sat on my desk every evening, looking exactly as it always had. That was one of the stranger things about those weeks, how entirely ordinary all the objects remained. The phone records were the beginning. Marcus and I had been on a shared family plan since the year we married. I had always managed our household subscriptions and billing. He found the administrative side of life tedious, and I did not, and we had settled into that arrangement early on without either of us deciding it. I had the account portal login, and had not used it in years. On a Thursday evening while Marcus was supposedly working late, I logged in and pulled the call records for the previous 4 months. The calls to Joanna's number were not subtle. Once I was looking at them, they had been increasing steadily since July. First a few per week, then daily, then multiple times per day on some days. The duration had grown with the frequency. 5-minute calls had become 30. Minute calls had become calls that ran over an hour. There was a pattern on Thursday afternoons that corresponded precisely with the blocked calendar entries. Calls placed between 2 and 4, from his cell to hers, running 40 minutes to just over an hour. Week after week, like a standing appointment, I wrote every date and duration into the leather notebook the way I would document anything professional. Writing it by hand made each entry specific and real in a way that a digital record would not have. By the time I finished the 4-month review, I had 12 pages of notes. The financial records came next, and they took longer. Marcus and I had 2 joint accounts, a checking account for household expenses and a savings account we had been building toward a 3rd-floor renovation we had been discussing for years, without starting, and we each had individual accounts maintained since before we were married. I could not access his personal account, but I could access the joint accounts, and what I found there when I went through the complete transaction history, rather than the monthly summaries I usually reviewed, was a pattern of ATM withdrawals I had not previously examined carefully. $200 here, $300 there, always in cash, always from machines in parts of Richmond. Neither of us had regular reason to visit. The withdrawals went back 8 months. I added them up 3 times and arrived at the same figure each time, $6,340. Withdrawn in 31 separate transactions spread across 8 months, in amounts modest enough that no single one would have caught my attention if I had been looking at them individually, rather than all at once. Cash is difficult to trace. I understood immediately, and professionally, why someone would use it. I mapped the withdrawal dates against Marcus's calendar. The larger amounts clustered on, or just before Thursdays, or in the days surrounding the overnight trips he had described as Project Reconnaissance, trips to other cities to assess potential clients, each one with a plausible professional explanation. I noted the dates and the calendar correlations in the notebook in red pen. Deborah came over on a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks into the investigation, ostensibly to help me go through the hall closet that had been a problem for 2 years. Deborah had been my closest friend since our freshman year of college. We had been through everything of significance in each other's lives since we were 18, and she had been a family law attorney for 15 years, which was why I had called her. We worked on the closet for about 40 minutes. Then we sat at the kitchen table, and I showed her the notebook. She read through it slowly, the way she read everything, completely, without rushing. When she finished, she set it down and looked at me. She said, "How long have you been doing this?" I said, 3 weeks. She said, "How much more do you have to find?" I told her about the savings account transfer I had discovered the previous week, $8,000 moved to an external account 9 months earlier, authorized under Marcus's login credentials. I told her the transfer had happened the same week that Joanna had sat on my couch and told me she was struggling to make rent after the divorce. Deborah was quiet for a moment. She looked at the notebook on the table between us. Then she said, "Sarah, the people who build the picture before they move are the ones who end up with choices. The people who react before they are ready end up with whatever the other person decides to hand them." I had known that, professionally, hearing it said that plainly, at my own kitchen table, on a Saturday afternoon, by someone who knew me well enough to say it that way, it settled something that had been shifting. I told her I was not done yet. She nodded. She said, "What else do you need? Before I tell you what I found next, tell me, what time is it where you are right now? Where are you watching from?" I'm always surprised how far these stories travel. What I found in the final week before Marcus sent his text was not a new category of evidence. It was something I had been sitting near for the entire investigation, without fully allowing myself to process. I was at my desk on a Sunday evening reviewing the folder one last time, not looking for anything new, just making sure the documentation was organized clearly before I called the attorney on Monday morning. I had the ATM records in front of me, $6,340 across 8 months. And there, in my own handwriting in the notes column, I had been keeping alongside the financial records. Joanna, same week as first withdrawal, said divorce depleted her. Struggling with rent, said she would figure it out. I had written that down. I had been sitting beside it for 3 weeks. And on that Sunday evening, something about having the complete picture laid out in front of me allowed the full meaning of it to arrive in a way it had not before. She had sat on my couch. She had cried. She had told me she did not know how she was going to manage the next few months. I had offered to help directly. She had said she would figure it out. The first withdrawal had already happened by then. The money had already been moving before we had that conversation. She had come to my house, sat on my couch, cried about money, and said she would figure it out, while accepting $6,000 in cash from my husband over the preceding weeks, using $8,000 from our joint savings account that she had been instrumental in prompting him to move. I sat with that for a long time. The house was very quiet. Marcus was downstairs watching television. I could hear faintly the sound of whatever he was watching, a low murmur of voices, the occasional music between segments. I closed the folder and locked it in my desk drawer and went downstairs. He said something about the score of a game. I said something back. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and stood at the window for a moment. The photograph in the silver frame was right there on the windowsill, the way it always was, the two of us squinting into the Outer Banks sun. I had walked past it 10,000 times without seeing it. Standing at the window that Sunday evening, I saw it again, saw it as a physical object, saw the two specific people recorded in it, understood that the photograph and the marriage and the house were 3 different things, and that I had been treating them as the same thing for long enough that the confusion had become invisible to me. I went to bed at 10:30. Marcus came up around midnight. 2 days later, at 11:42 on a Tuesday night, his text arrived. 4 sentences. The last one said, "It was for my sister." I typed 1 word. Put the phone down, made tea, sat at the kitchen table. I was ready. I called Karen Walsh on Monday morning from my office with the door closed. Karen had been recommended to me by a colleague who had used her 2 years earlier during a divorce that had involved both a contested property and a business. The colleague's description of her had been brief and useful. She does not waste your time, and she does not require you to explain things more than once. Karen had a cancellation that Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock, the same time slot that had been blocked on Marcus's calendar for 11 consecutive weeks. I registered that without saying anything about it when the receptionist offered me the appointment. Her office was on the second floor of a building on Elwood Avenue in Carytown, above a coffee shop that had been there long enough that the regulars arrived in sequence every morning, the same people in the same order, taking the same seats. I went up the stairs at 2 on Thursday afternoon carrying the folder, printed records, the notebook, a 4-page typed summary I had put together on Wednesday evening after Marcus went to sleep. Karen was in her mid-50s, compact and direct in the way of someone who has had the same difficult conversation many times and has learned exactly what each part of it requires and exactly what it does not. She took the folder and read through it without asking me to summarize it first. This took about 20 minutes. When she finished, she set it down and looked at me. She said, "You've done the analytical groundwork. What you need now is the legal structure around it." She walked me through the Virginia statutes on divorce and equitable distribution. She explained the difference between a no-fault filing and a fault-based filing, and what the evidence I had would support. She described the financial records as strong, specific, documented, with a clear timeline. She described the email thread as potentially the strongest single piece of evidence, because it established not just the existence of the relationship, but its duration and character. At the end of the meeting, she said, "You are in a very solid position. The documentation is clear, and the timeline is well established. When you are ready to move forward, we are ready to move with you." I told her I would be in touch within the week. Walking out, I passed the coffee shop on the ground floor. Through the window, I could see the afternoon regulars. People with laptops, people with books, a pair of women about my age talking over cups that had gone cold. An entirely ordinary Thursday afternoon happening on the other side of the glass. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the November air. Then I walked to my car and drove home. Marcus was not there when I arrived. I made dinner and ate it alone at the kitchen table. The photograph in the silver frame caught the kitchen light from the windowsill in a particular way that evening. Just the frame, actually, the image itself in shadow from that angle. I looked at it while I ate without thinking anything specific about it. Then I washed the dishes and went upstairs and prepared for what was coming. The divorce proceedings were filed the following Monday morning. Karen moved quickly, which was what I had asked for. The filing included a request for temporary orders related to the joint assets, specifically a freeze on further transfers from the savings account, and a notation on the joint checking account pending resolution. The $8,000 transfer that had already occurred was flagged as a marital asset dissipated without consent. Marcus was served at his office on Wednesday afternoon at approximately 2 o'clock. His first call to me came that evening, at 6:14. I watched my phone light up with his name and did not answer it. His second call came the following morning at 8:50, while I was in a meeting. I did not answer that one either. I sent a text to Karen, and she confirmed what I already understood. All communication should proceed through our respective attorneys from this point forward. He sent one text message directly to me, 4 days after being served. It said, "I think we should talk before this goes any further. Can we please just talk?" I read it once. I did not respond. The formal mediation session took place 6 weeks after filing, on a grey January morning in a conference room at Karen's firm. A neutral space, long table, 4 chairs, a window that looked out onto a parking structure. Marcus came with his attorney, a man named Gerald who wore an expensive watch and spoke in the measured cadence of someone accustomed to controlling the pace of rooms. Karen sat beside me with 2 organized folders and the notebook I had given her, which she had returned with small annotations in the margins in a different color ink. Marcus looked different than he had in the weeks before I filed, not dramatically altered, just reduced, somehow. The ease that had always been part of how he carried himself was gone in a way that I noticed immediately and found unexpectedly neither satisfying nor painful, just accurate. He looked like someone who had lost something and was beginning to understand the size of what it was. Karen presented the documentation in sequence. She did not rush it and she did not perform it. The call records, organized by date, with the Thursday pattern highlighted across 11 weeks. The ATM withdrawal history, with the total figure and the pattern across 8 months. The savings account transfer, with the date, the amount, and the fact that it had been authorized without my knowledge or consent. Each item placed on the table in front of Gerald with the same quiet efficiency you use when the facts are doing the work, and your job is simply not to interrupt them. When she reached the savings account transfer, Gerald looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the table in front of him. Karen said, "The transfer of $8,000 from the joint savings account occurred on September 14th. Can your client explain the purpose of that transfer?" Gerald conferred quietly with Marcus. Then Marcus said, without raising his eyes from the table, "I was trying to help her." His voice was flat. Not defensive, just flat, in the way voices get when someone has already had the argument with themselves and lost it before arriving in the room. I looked at him when he said it. He did not look back at me. Karen said, "And your client made this decision unilaterally, without discussion with Miss Calloway." Gerald said, "My client acknowledges the transfer was not discussed." Karen nodded and moved to the next item. The leather notebook sat in my bag under the table throughout the session. I had not needed to bring it. Karen had her own copies of everything, but I had picked it up from my desk that morning, without quite deciding to, and slipped it into my bag, and it had been there under the table through the entire proceeding. The worn cover, the small rough ridge where the pen clip used to be, just there, the weight of it familiar against my knee. Gerald attempted a counter-argument about the nature of marital finances and the informal support that spouses sometimes provide to family members of the other spouse. Karen let him finish. Then she placed one more document on the table, the email thread, printed and flagged at 3 specific exchanges, none of them about anything that could be described as informal family support. Gerald looked at the flagged pages. He looked at Marcus. Marcus was still looking at the table. The mediation session ended 90 minutes after it began. No resolution was reached that day. Gerald requested additional time to review the documentation. Karen agreed to 2 weeks and set the next meeting date. Walking out of the building, I stood for a moment on the sidewalk in the January cold. The parking structure across the street was full, people moving through it in the particular purposeful way of people who have somewhere ordinary to be. A completely normal Wednesday morning, continuing around us, as though the room we had just been sitting in did not exist. I drove back to my office and worked until 6. The divorce took 7 months from filing to finalization. Virginia allows fault-based divorce, and the documentation Karen had assembled supported that filing clearly. The equitable distribution calculation reflected the dissipated marital assets, the $8,000 savings transfer, treated as funds removed from the marital estate without consent, was factored into the settlement in my favor. The $6,300 in cash withdrawals was addressed through a separate line in the settlement, characterized as unilateral expenditure of joint funds. Gerald contested several points. Karen had anticipated every one of them. The process moved slowly in the way that legal processes always move slowly, with periods of waiting between periods of response, and I learned to treat the waiting as its own kind of work, keeping my records organized, responding promptly to Karen's requests for information, letting the process take the time it required without trying to accelerate it. Marcus moved out of the Floyd Avenue house 3 weeks after I filed. He made 4 trips to his car on a Saturday morning, carrying boxes and 2 duffel bags. I was not at the house for any of it. I had arranged to spend the morning at Deborah's, and she made good coffee, and we sat in her kitchen and talked about her daughter's upcoming school play, and a novel she had been working through for 2 months, and a restaurant near her office she had been meaning to try. The conversation required nothing of me, except to be present for it, which was exactly what I needed. Deborah did not ask how I was feeling about what was happening at the house. She had asked that question 2 weeks earlier, and received an honest answer, and she understood that the honest answer had not changed and did not need to be revisited every time we saw each other. That is one of the things about a friendship that has lasted long enough. You learn which questions need asking again, and which ones have already been answered. The house sold in August, to a young couple who had walked through it twice, and made an offer the same evening. I met them at the closing, and liked them. They had the specific energy of people who have just gotten something they had been wanting for a long time. I signed the papers, and handed over the keys, and walked out of the building into the August heat, and sat in my car for a few minutes, before starting it. I had left the iron planter on the front stoop. It had been there when we arrived. I saw no reason to take it. Joanna called me in March, 3 months after I filed. I let the first call go to voicemail. She called again 2 days later, and I answered. She said she was sorry. She said she had been telling herself things that made what she did easier to do, and that she understood now that those things had not been true. She did not ask me to forgive her specifically. She just said she was sorry, and then stopped talking, and let the silence be there. I listened to all of it. I did not fill the silence when she stopped. When she finished, I said, "I know." She said, "Do you think you'll ever?" I said, "I don't know. Not right now." That was the most honest answer I had. And she heard it that way. We ended the call. I sat at my desk for a while afterward without doing anything in particular. Then I went back to work. My mother called me twice a week throughout those 7 months. We did not talk directly about Joanna most of the time. We moved around her the way you move around something that is present in a room, but that neither of you is yet ready to name out loud. My mother is a practical woman who has spent 68 years managing difficult things without making a production of the managing. She did not ask me to forgive anyone. She did not ask me to call. She just called twice a week and asked how I was and listened to whatever I said. And that turned out to be more useful than almost anything else anyone offered me during those months. My colleague Renee, who had gone through her own divorce 2 years earlier and who had recommended Karen, left a small potted succulent on my desk one morning with a note that said, "It gets less strange." No other context. I watered the plant more reliably than I had ever managed to water the herbs on the Floyd Avenue kitchen windowsill. And the note turned out to be accurate. Not quickly, and not in a straight line, but it got less strange. The apartment I moved into in October was in the Museum District, on a tree-lined Block 3 streets from the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. 2nd floor, 2 bedrooms. Original hardwood floors with deep scratches I had decided to leave, because they were part of the floor rather than damage to it. The kitchen was smaller than I was used to, and the morning light came through the east window differently than I had been accustomed to. But after a few weeks, it started to feel like mine, the specific way that a space starts to feel like yours, when you have been alone in it long enough that your own patterns have begun to shape it. I unpacked slowly. I did not have a deadline. I let boxes sit in corners until I understood where I wanted things to go. The neighborhood was quieter than the fan, a different rhythm. It took some adjusting to, and then it stopped requiring adjustment. And then one morning I realized I had stopped comparing it to anything at all. About 9 months after the divorce was finalized, on a Saturday morning in late October, I was making coffee in my kitchen and not thinking about very much. The Museum District in October does what Richmond does in October. The trees turn in overlapping stages. The light changes to something specific and low and golden that only exists at this latitude at this time of year. And the streets have a quality of being exactly right in a way they are not quite right at any other time. I had started running in the mornings over the summer, along the boulevard and back, something I had been telling myself I would do for 3 years, and had not done until I had mornings that were entirely my own to schedule. By October, I was running 4 mornings a week, and on the mornings I did not run, I walked, and the neighborhood was becoming familiar in the particular way that a place becomes familiar when you move through it at a pace that allows you to actually see it. I had poured my coffee and was standing at the kitchen window when I noticed, on the windowsill, the photograph in the thin silver frame. I had brought it with me when I moved out of the Floyd Avenue house. Not deliberately, not as a decision. It had been on the windowsill, and I had been packing the kitchen, and I had wrapped it in a dish towel and put it in a box with other small objects. And when I unpacked the box in the new apartment, I had set it on the windowsill without thinking about it because the windowsill was where it lived, and there it had stayed for 9 months. The two of us on the Outer Banks, both squinting into the summer sun, him with his arm around me, both of us grinning at whoever was behind the camera. I picked it up that morning and held it with both hands. I looked at the photograph for a while, really looked at it, not the way I had looked at it for years without seeing it, but actually looked at the 2 specific people recorded in it, and the specific afternoon recorded in it, and the particular happiness that was in both of our faces that afternoon, which I still believed had been real. Some things can be real, and also not be enough. Some things can be true about a person, and also be only part of the truth about them. I had spent some time in the past several months learning to hold both of those ideas at the same time without needing to resolve them into a single cleaner verdict. There was a small crack along the bottom left corner of the silver frame that I was seeing for the first time. It had probably been there for years. I had simply never held the frame closely enough to notice it before. I stood at the window with the photograph in my hands for another moment. Then I opened the cabinet under the kitchen counter, found the cardboard box of things I had not yet sorted through, and placed the photograph inside it, face down, gently, deliberately, not thrown away, just put away. There is a difference between those 2 things, and I knew clearly which one I meant. The coffee was still warm. I drank it standing at the window, watching a man walk past on the sidewalk below with a dog that was extremely interested in a pile of leaves that had accumulated against the base of the tree on the curb. The dog investigated the leaves with great seriousness. The man waited. The morning continued. I thought about nothing in particular, which was something I had become considerably better at over the previous several months. The ability to think about nothing in particular, to simply be in a moment without it requiring something of you, is something you do not notice you have lost until you start getting it back. There is a specific kind of clarity that arrives after you have been through something difficult and documented it carefully. It is not the same as happiness, and it does not arrive all at once, and it does not make the difficult thing not have happened. What it does is give you a place to stand, solid ground that you built yourself, from evidence and patience and the decision to wait until you had the full picture before you moved. I had that ground now. What came next was simply living on it. Here is what I find myself returning to on ordinary mornings when I am not deliberately thinking about any of this. When someone shows you something small, a laugh that stops when you walk in, a name that appears too frequently in the wrong places, a calendar blocked in the same way 11 weeks in a row, how long do you allow the comfort of the larger picture to keep you from looking at it directly? And what does it cost you, that distance between the moment you first see something and the moment you finally let yourself understand it? I do not have a clean answer to either question. I am not sure the questions are meant to have clean answers. What I know is that the word I sent at 11:42 on a Tuesday night was not really about him. It was not about the text message, or what it said, or who it was about. It was about the 14 months between the evening in Carytown when I noticed the laugh stop, and the night I finally had everything I needed laid out in a folder on my desk. It was about the woman who built the picture carefully, who added to it systematically, who did not move until she was ready, who made one call on a Monday morning, and then trusted the process to take it from there. She was ready because she had done the work. That is the whole of it. The truth does not need your fury to be true. It only needs your patience. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story stayed with you, I would be honored if you shared it with someone who might need it. Leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from, and whether you have ever had to choose truth when silence would have been easier. I read every single one. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe. I have many more to share, and I would love to have you here for the next one. There was a small balcony off the living room, barely large enough for 2 chairs, that I had not used through the winter. In October, when the weather turned and the trees on the block started doing what Richmond trees do in October, I started sitting out there in the mornings with my coffee before the day started, not thinking about anything particular. Just sitting in the early light, while the street below came slowly to life. A man who walked his dog at the same time every morning. A woman who left for work at 7:15, and always looked slightly rushed. The ordinary rhythms of a street that was becoming familiar. It became one of the better parts of my week in a way I had not anticipated when I signed the lease. Small routines have a way of becoming foundations without your noticing. And by November, the balcony chair and the morning coffee, and the particular quality of the October, and then November light had become something I counted on in a quiet way. I called my mother from the balcony one Sunday morning in November, which was something I had not done before. I usually called from inside, from the kitchen or the couch. She picked up on the second ring, the way she always did, and I told her I was sitting outside and she said, "It sounded peaceful," and I said it was. We talked for 45 minutes about nothing significant and everything real, which is what the best conversations with your mother tend to be. And when we hung up, I sat there for a while longer just listening to the street.